Manchester City won their final 14 games in a row at the end of the 2018-19 season, beating a Liverpool team that won 97 points to the title. Man City's title made them English football's first and only ever domestic treble winners, an achievement that Alex Ferguson had previously described as being impossible. Meanwhile, Liverpool lifted that season's Champions League, beating Spurs in the final. Behind those two was a Chelsea team that lifted that season's Europa League title, beating Arsenal in the final, and reached the League Cup final, followed by the Champions League final losers Tottenham, the Europa League final losers Arsenal, and finally Manchester United. This was the pinnacle of the Big Six era. For the third successive season, and the fourth time in only 5 years, the Premier League's so-called Big Six occupied the league's top 6 positions. And it wasn't even close. There were no consistent challengers to the Big Six. Wolves finished 7th that season, 9 points behind the Red Devils in 6th. The previous season it was Sean Dyche's Burnley, also 9 points behind Arsenal, and the season before that it was Ronald Koeman's Everton, 8 points behind Man United. These were the 6 clubs who not only had the biggest budgets, the highest revenue, and the largest global fan bases, but also the best players and the strongest squads. Fast forward just 6 years though, and suddenly, their status no longer seems quite so assured. Manchester United and Tottenham just finished 15th and 17th, their lowest league finishes in 50 and 47 years respectively. Meanwhile, Newcastle finished in the top 5 for the second time in 3 seasons, qualifying for the Champions League. Aston Villa finished 6th, qualifying for Europe for a 3rd straight season, and Nottingham Forest finished 7th, over 20 points ahead of either Man United or Spurs, returning to Europe for the first time in 30 years. In the cup competitions likewise, Newcastle beat Liverpool in the final of this season's EFL Cup, Crystal Palace overcame Man City in the final of the FA Cup, and Aston Villa went further in the Champions League than either Manchester City or Liverpool. Whilst freak seasons have always happened every now and then, this doesn't appear to be a one-off. Manchester United finished 8th last season, Chelsea finished 12th the season before that, and Arsenal recorded successive 8th place finishes in the 2019-20 and 2020-21 campaigns. Aston Villa, meanwhile, finished 4th last season, above Man United, Chelsea and Spurs. Newcastle finished 4th the season before that, above Liverpool, and even Brighton have finished above half of the so-called Big Six over the last 3 seasons alone. It's not like Spurs and Man United just dropped out of the top 6 either, as happened to Big Six clubs intermittently during the 2010s. The pair of them were closer, both positionally and in terms of points, to getting relegated than they were to the top 7, let alone the top 4 or 5. Aston Villa, who were relegated as one of the worst Premier League teams of all time less than 10 years ago, and finished 5th in the Championship when the Big Six reached their zenith in 2018-19, are now shorter odds to win the Premier League title next season than either Spurs or Man United. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that some people are asking whether the Big Six era, much like Henry Kissinger, could finally be dead. And when the people ask, Alfie answers. This wasn't nicknamed the People's Channel for nothing. No, it was actually because of a comment left on a video titled 7 Best Players Left Out of the 2018 World Cup Squads, brackets, Part 2, end brackets, almost 7 years ago, by Thomas Kendall-Witch Stark. Unfortunately, Thomas would quickly come to be disillusioned with both me and my videos because they became, quote, too political, branding me the most arrogant and condescending person on YouTube instead. As far as I'm concerned, both nicknames are perfectly accurate. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey from London to the northwest of England, a distance of less than 200 miles, which is home to 6 of the world's 10 richest football clubs. And that may serve as a hint, as we take a look at whether the Big Six is still relevant as a concept, why some of England's super clubs have faltered in recent years, and who, if anyone, could realistically replace them. The Big Six is sometimes talked about as though it was some kind of ancient tradition of the English game. In reality, it is a relatively recent invention. The Premier League's breakaway from the Football League in 1992 was spearheaded by the chairman and owners of a so-called Big Five, made up of Arsenal, Everton, Liverpool, Man United and Spurs, who wanted to negotiate their own television rights deals, independent of the Football League, and keep more of the revenue for themselves. The Big Five would be a relatively short-lived term, however, as both Tottenham and Everton flirted with relegation within the first few years of the Premier League era, and ceded ground in terms of revenue to other clubs. Manchester United dominated the early years of the Premier League, winning 4 out of the first 5 titles, before Arsene Wenger's revolution at Arsenal gave them serious long-term competition. Over the next 8 years, the Gunners and the Red Devils were sometimes referred to as the top 2, which made sense given that they occupied the top 2 places in the Premier League 5 times during that time, and regularly contested in fierce rivalries and title challenges. The top 2 became a top 4 in 2003 though, made up of Man United, Arsenal, Liverpool and Chelsea, after Roman Abramovich bought the latter and began investing sums of money that had never previously been seen in the Premier League, or anywhere else for that matter. The top 4 was a ubiquitous term throughout my childhood and formative years as a football fan, and, again, it made a lot of sense. Since these 4 clubs occupied the top 4 places in the Premier League virtually every season, qualifying for the Champions League as a result. Liverpool only finished outside of the top 4 twice in 10 years, and in one of those seasons they qualified for the Champions League regardless by winning it. Chelsea only missed out once in 13 years, Arsenal finished in the top 4 for 20 consecutive seasons, and Manchester United never finished outside of the top 3 under Alex Ferguson during the Premier League era. The fact that these 4 qualified for the Champions League so routinely gave them a huge advantage in terms of revenue, fanbase and prestige over the other 16 Premier League teams, and it is a large part of why they are still so-called Big Six constituents now. The expansion from a top 4 to a Big Six came at the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s, when Tottenham began a run of 11 straight top 6 finishes under Harry Redknapp, and Manchester City, not unlike Chelsea before them, established themselves as a major force in English football for the first time in over 40 years, owing to Sheikh Mansour's takeover, the vast influx of Emirati capital, and a staggering increase in wage and transfer expenditure. From the 2009-10 season onwards, no member of the Big Six finished outside of the Premier League's top 8 for 13 consecutive seasons, with the sole exception of Chelsea, who finished 10th as defending title winners in the 2015-16 campaign. That was the only time that Chelsea finished outside of the top 6 in 10 years, Liverpool did so thrice, Manchester United and Arsenal each did so once, and Manchester City and Tottenham didn't do so once during that time. What's more, the so-called disruptor clubs, looking to gatecrash the Big Six, never mounted a consistent challenge. At the start of the Big Six era, Aston Villa and Everton were the 2 teams in and around it, but Villa fell off a cliff whilst Everton more gradually slipped away. Southampton and Wolves had brief flirtations, and Leicester actually won the league but were involved in a relegation scrap the following season, before mounting a short-lived resurgence under Brendan Rodgers, falling away again, and then getting relegated. In fact, in 10 years, only 5 non-Big Six teams managed to break into the top 6, Villa, Newcastle, Everton, Leicester and Southampton, and of those 5, Everton are the only ones who haven't since been relegated. And even then, only just. I sometimes see it asked why the top 6 or Big Six ever came into being as a concept, or why it was those 6 clubs, but for over a decade, they really were relentlessly dominant and practically untouchable, both on and off the pitch. That began to change during the first COVID season though, and I want to make this absolutely clear, I'm not suggesting that correlation equals causation, or that was a side effect of either the virus or the vaccine. Whatever you think about Pfizer, I don't think that they can be blamed for Arsenal paying 72 million quid for Nicolas Pepe. The 2019-20 season was Arsenal's worst in 25 years, as they finished 8th, below Wolves and only 2 points ahead of newly promoted Sheffield United, having both won 14 games. It is hard to believe that was only 5 years ago. In the 2020-21 season, Arsenal repeated their feat, finishing 8th again in Mikel Arteta's first full season in charge, as their North London rivals Tottenham joined them in dropping out of the top 6 for the first time in over a decade, following a failed experiment with Jose Mourinho, as Leicester City and West Ham leapfrogged them into the top 6. The Big Six reasserted themselves the following season, but in 2022-23, following their takeover by the Saudi state, Newcastle became only the second non-Big Six club to qualify for the Champions League group stages in 20 years, so only the second during the Big Six era, along with Leicester in 2016-17. Meanwhile, Brighton finished 6th, Spurs slipped all the way down to 8th, and Chelsea, after the highest spending season in the entire history of world football, finished 12th, below London rivals Brentford, Fulham, and Crystal Palace. Aston Villa finished 4th the following season, meaning that, also for the first time in more than 20 years, and therefore for the first time during the so-called Big Six era, non-Big Six teams had qualified for the Champions League in successive seasons. Meanwhile, Manchester United slipped to 8th, their lowest league finish since the 1989-90 season, 34 years ago, before the formation of the Premier League. And this season, of course, has seen the greatest upending of the Big Six for a generation, as Manchester United recorded their lowest league finish in half a century, plummeting to 15th. Spurs fared even worse in the league, finishing directly above the bottom 3, and Newcastle, Aston Villa, Nottingham Forest, and, via the FA Cup, even Crystal Palace, all gatecrashed the European places. It is absolutely inarguable, therefore, that the Big Six no longer have a firm grip upon the upper echelons of the English game, and that they are now capable of sinking, at least in the short term, further than at any other stage since they have existed as a concept. The reasons for that are twofold. 1. The other 11, that is to say, the rest of the Premier League, excluding the Big Six and the 3 promoted clubs, who now face an immense task just to stay in the division, are both richer and smarter than ever before, and 2, whilst also being richer than ever before themselves, some members of the Big Six, at certain times, have been much less smartly run. Yes, Manchester United, I am looking at you. A large part of the success of the Premier League's business model is its more equitable income distribution. Not equitable throughout English football, of course, quite the opposite in fact. Making sure that wasn't the case was basically the whole reason behind its creation, but within the league itself, the Premier League's enormous broadcast revenue is much more evenly distributed than in any other major league. So when it comes to the Premier League's central payments to clubs, based upon domestic and international rights deals, Manchester City and Arsenal both received £175.9 million last season, which was the joint most in the division, but Burnley and Sheffield United, who finished 19th and 20th, and were therefore relegated, still received £110 and £109 million. That's despite the fact that 28 and 31 of Man City and Arsenal's 38 games over the course of the season were selected for domestic television coverage, compared to just 10 and 13 games at Burnley and Sheffield United. If the Premier League's broadcast revenue were distributed based upon the number of games chosen for television, viewing figures, or domestic and global fan bases or appeal, we would see much more distorted distribution and a much higher percentage being retained by the so-called Big Six, who have far more international fans and televised games than anyone else, and that is what we see in almost every other league. La Liga, for example, which has always lagged behind the Premier League in terms of revenue and commercial success, despite arguably being a stronger league in terms of talent and standard of football throughout much of the 2000s and into the 2010s, allowed teams to sell their TV rights individually until recently, resulting in massive discrepancies between the league's biggest and smallest clubs. In the 2014-15 season, for example, Real Madrid and Barcelona each received a 21% share of the league's total revenue through television rights, worth in excess of €160 million each. The 7 lowest revenue-generating clubs, by contrast, Deportivo La Coruña, Granada, Elche, Almeria, Córdoba, Rayo Vallecano and Eibar, each received just 2% of La Liga's revenue through television rights, each receiving less than €20 million. The division's highest-earning clubs, therefore, received over 10 times as much in television revenue as the lowest-earning clubs. In the Premier League, by contrast, the league's highest earners when it comes to broadcast revenue don't even rake in twice as much, just 1.6 times, the lowest earning clubs. It is no surprise, therefore, that Real Madrid, Barcelona and, to a slightly lesser extent, Atletico Madrid, have been untouchable in La Liga for such a long time, and that is of course before you factor in matchday and commercial revenue, where the disparities can be even greater still. About 10 years ago, La Liga voted in favour of selling their television rights collectively and more equitable income distribution, noticing that the Premier League was leaving them for dead, and the percentage of television revenue that went to Real Madrid and Barcelona roughly halved, from 21% on average down to 11%. Nonetheless, the gulf between the highest earning and the lowest earning teams from La Liga's central coffers is still enormous when compared with the Premier League. Real Madrid and Barcelona earned 317 and 242 million euros in La Liga broadcast revenue last season, whilst 8 teams, or 40% of the division, earned less than 50 million euros. La Liga's highest earners, therefore, still earn around 7 times as much as the division's lowest earners from broadcast revenue, compared to that 1.6 times figure in the Premier League. The result of this is that the smaller teams in the Premier League, outside of the Big Six, are much more competitive than the smaller teams in almost any other elite league, and also, as the value of the Premier League's collective broadcast revenue has risen, they have become quite staggeringly rich. Luton Town's broadcast revenue in the 2023-24 season alone, a club who were relegated that season and who are now playing in League One, was higher than Athletic Club, Valencia, and Villarreal's total revenue, and that is before even factoring in any of Luton's commercial or matchday income. 14 out of the 30 highest revenue-generating teams in the world are Premier League clubs, and all of them are in the top 40, even the 3 relegated clubs. In other words, then, 70% of the Premier League's 20 teams are among the world's 30 richest clubs, and half of the world's 40 richest clubs all compete in a single league from a single country, which is home to less than 1% of the world's population. The Premier League has been a roaring commercial success pretty much ever since its foundation, but the gap between it and every other league has widened greatly over time. In the 1999-2000 season, only 2 out of the world's 10 richest clubs competed in the Premier League. Now the entire Big Six are in the top 10, with Real Madrid, Barcelona, PSG and Bayern Munich the only non-Premier League teams in alongside them. 10 years ago, Juventus's revenue was over double that of either Newcastle United or West Ham. Now West Ham bring in almost equivalent revenue to the Italian giants, Newcastle have exceeded them, and Spurs rake in more money than Napoli and Juventus combined. Brighton's revenue is higher than Napoli's, Bournemouth and Brentford, minnows in Premier League terms, with 11,286 and 17,250 capacity stadiums, have higher revenue than either 7-time Europa League title winner Sevilla and 6-time La Liga title winners Valencia, and literally every single team in the Premier League, including the relegated clubs like Luton or Sheffield United last season, have higher revenue now than 4-time European champions and Dutch giants Ajax. That's one of those stats that, despite being provably true, these clubs literally publish their annual accounts, still seems to be impossible. In what world can Luton Town have a higher revenue than Ajax? Well, in this world, apparently. Well, not anymore, of course, they have been relegated to League One, but you get the idea. West Ham, Bournemouth, Newcastle and Nottingham Forest net spend over the last 3 seasons is higher than Barcelona, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, Juventus and indeed, quite literally, every single club in world football outside of the Premier League, Saudi Arabia and PSG. Monaco and Atalanta, the 2 teams who finished 3rd in Ligue 1 and Serie A this season, have less combined revenue than Aston Villa on their own. It is absolutely wild. Those are a lot of stats just to say that the entire Premier League is incredibly competitive from a financial perspective. It has become a de facto Super League, where the teams who finish 15th and 17th are both capable of reaching the final of the Europa League, and even relegation-threatened clubs can outspend all but a handful of elite clubs throughout the entire rest of Europe. The Premier League has long enjoyed fairly immense financial supremacy within world football, but it was also the case that many Premier League teams were quite reckless and stupid when it came to resource allocation. Bundesliga and La Liga teams were envious of Premier League revenue, but in the same breath, they would mock the league's wastefulness and the inflated fees that they received from Premier League clubs for their players. What has happened in recent years, however, is that the financial gulf has become so great that even a huge trade imbalance, one which would undoubtedly result in Donald Trump putting 300% tariffs on every other league if he ran the Premier League, doesn't come close to compensating for the giant chasm in other revenue sectors, and Premier League clubs, especially those outside of the Big Six, have also become much more tactful. Brentford and Brighton scouting, for example, or Brightford as I prefer to collectively refer to them, is as extensive as almost any super club, and their recruitment is as pointed and shrewd as any club on the continent. Brighton have raised over 3 times as much money through player sales over the last 3 years as Real Madrid, resulting in a lower net spend than either Como or Marseille, all while benefiting from Premier League revenue, unlike those two. Meanwhile, Brentford are the best-run club in the Premier League by most metrics, and among the best in the world, finishing in the top half of the most competitive league on the planet, with the 4th lowest wage bill in the division. Brentford's revenue, meanwhile, is higher than the likes of Lazio, Fiorentina, Sevilla, and Athletic clubs. Those two are the most outstanding examples, but Unai Emery and his staff have strained every single sinew out of Aston Villa's budget and playing squad in recent years. Newcastle, despite their vast resources, as the world's richest state-owned club, have been careful and considered in most of their post-takeover recruitment and squad planning, and both Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth have plucked out gems like Murillo, Dango Ouattara, and Dean Huijsen for relative bargain fees over the last couple of years. Whether you look at ELO, Opta, or any other data measuring the relative strength of teams and leagues, it is evident that, even if still not quite to the degree that it should, the Premier League's economic advantages over every other league is expressed far more in the actual standard of the teams and players throughout the entire division than it was 5, 10, or 20 years ago. As I mentioned just a couple of weeks ago on this channel, 10 years ago, 36% of the world's 300 top players, according to Transfermarkt, played in the Premier League. That has now risen to 53%, so more than half, but whilst the percentage playing for the Big Six clubs has only risen by 3%, up from 29 to 32% during that time, the number playing for the league's other 14 clubs has skyrocketed from just 7 up to 21%, a trebling in the space of just a decade. As a result, when Big Six clubs slip up and make mistakes, as several of them have done in recent years, there is invariably a challenger club, or a handful of them, who are ready to pounce. That is why a bad season for a Big Six club no longer means finishing 7th or 8th, but actually 10th, 12th, or, in the case of 2 of the 6 this season, 15th and 17th. In that sense, the Big Six era is dead, or at the very least comatose. In another sense, however, it is very much alive and well. As fast as the revenue of the Premier League's non-Big Six clubs has grown, so too has the revenue of the Big Six themselves. Brighton may be richer than Napoli and Newcastle richer than Juventus now, but Brighton's revenue is still less than half that of Chelsea's, who had the lowest revenue of any Big Six club last season, and Newcastle's revenue is less than half of either of the 2 Manchester clubs. The revenue gap between Chelsea, the lowest revenue generating Big Six club, and Newcastle, the highest revenue generating non-Big Six club, is still €174 million. Just think of the difference that €174 million a season makes in terms of wage budgets, transfer expenditure, when transfer fees are amortised over the length of the contract, and in PSR considerations. The gap between Man City, the highest revenue generating Big Six club, and Bournemouth, the lowest revenue generating team to survive in the Premier League last season, was €659 million. Over the past decade, the revenue of the non-Big Six teams has climbed from 40% of the Big Six, on average, up to 47.8%, a gradual but relatively marginal rise in percentage terms. Meanwhile, the gap in absolute terms, despite the sporting gap having shrunk during that time, has actually widened. What all of that means is that the Big Six clubs have an effective comfort blanket, and insurance policy when it comes to making mistakes, overpaying for players, or having bad seasons, a luxury which no other Premier League clubs are afforded. Arsenal missed out on the Champions League for 6 successive seasons and finished 8th in back-to-back campaigns, but by virtue of their commercial and matchday revenue, by the time that they returned to the Champions League, 6 years later, they had only fallen from having the 7th to the 10th highest revenue in world football. Contrast that with Leicester City, who won the Premier League title in 2016, the FA Cup in 2021, and who enjoyed consecutive top 5 finishes in the 2019-20 and 2020-21 seasons, finishing above Arsenal. You may recall at that time, after finishing above both Spurs and Arsenal in back-to-back seasons, there was talk of whether Leicester had broken into the Big Six, and whether it should now be called a Big Seven. The Foxes spent a fortune constructing a state-of-the-art training ground, befitting of a Big Six or Seven club, and they invested heavily in their playing squad in an effort to compete with the Big Six long-term. By the 2020-21 season, Leicester's wage bill was by far the highest outside of the Big Six, much closer in fact to Tottenham's wage bill at £205 versus £192 million than it was to the league's 8th highest wage bill, Everton's, at £165 million. But the Foxes slipped to 8th in the 2021-22 season and failed to qualify for Europe, leaving a major black hole in their finances. Though Leicester's wage bill was virtually neck and neck with Tottenham's, and not far behind Arsenal's, their revenues still trailed both of the Big Six giants by more than £100 million. Without European football, that gap grew to more than £150 million in the case of Arsenal, and over £200 million in the case of Spurs. Consequently, Leicester lost a massive £92 million on top of £33 and £67 million over the 2 previous seasons, leaving them in serious regulatory trouble ahead of the 2022-23 campaign. Wesley Fofana was sold for £70 to £75 million to Chelsea, but Leicester found it virtually impossible to offload their underperforming high earners, leaving them unable to refresh their faltering squad. That created a perfect storm which, combined with serious injuries to key players like James Maddison and Harvey Barnes, saw the Foxes relegated in the 2022-23 season. Though they returned to the Premier League last season as Championship title winners, Leicester only won 25 points in the top flight this season, went straight back down, and are now facing a likely 12-point deduction in the Championship next season, owing to PSR breaches. Leicester made mistakes, of course, for which they are to blame, but Arsenal, Tottenham, Chelsea and Man United have all made similar, and in fact, much greater mistakes in recent years, without paying anywhere near as big of a price in terms of their future revenue and future prospects as a result. The same is true for the likes of Forest, Villa and even Newcastle. If they make just a handful of costly errors, the challenge that they pose to the Big Six could be over as fast as the Foxes. There is a fragility, therefore, to the disruptor clubs, which doesn't apply to the Big Six. What doesn't often get talked about is the fact that there is a blueprint for breaking into the Big Six, and that is Tottenham Hotspur. Unlike Man United, Liverpool and Arsenal, who are historically the 3 biggest and most successful clubs in English football by some margin, and both Man City and Chelsea, who broke into the Big Six by virtue of being bankrolled by oligarchs and nation-states, Tottenham's revenue was lower than Leeds and Newcastle's in the early 2000s, and nearly dipped below Sunderland's at one stage. It took Daniel Levy and Joe Lewis 2 decades of making very few major economic mistakes, constantly maintaining a low wage-to-turnover percentage, making lucrative and tactful player sales, breaking into the Champions League on a regular basis, and eventually building one of the best and most profitable stadiums in the world, all while winning virtually nothing because they never spent beyond their means and were consistently the lowest spending Big Six club as they looked to maintain their Big Six status in order for Spurs to properly establish themselves. Even then, Spurs benefited from several inbuilt advantages that don't apply to most other challenger clubs. They are the 6th most successful club in the history of English football for a start, benefiting from a history of high-profile successes. They have a huge fan base, they are located in London, making them an attractive proposition to players and coaches, and able to charge some of the highest ticket prices in the Premier League, and they benefited from historically low interest rates when they borrowed £872 million on very favourable terms in order to build their huge new stadium. So if Leicester provide a cautionary tale, Spurs provide the blueprint. But not only is that blueprint extremely difficult to execute, very time-consuming, and rife with criticism owing to an alleged lack of ambition, much of it isn't even replicable for most clubs, like Leicester, who can't just transform themselves into former greats, relocate to one of the world's great cities, or control interest rates and the terms at which banks are willing to lend money at any given time. Likewise, Chelsea and Man City may previously have provided the blueprint for a suddenly incredibly wealthy club like Newcastle, spending their way into consistently challenging the big boys, but as a result of the creation and then the tightening of spending regulations and loss limits, it is no longer possible for the Saudis to flex their financial muscles in the same way as Abramovich or the Emiratis. There are valid complaints relating to PSR, which I have covered in previous videos, but in theory, they force a club like Newcastle or Aston Villa to build revenue in a more sustainable way through increasing the capacity of their stadium or the standard of their academy, for example, as opposed to being able to throw limitless amounts of foreign state capital at an English football club in a system whereby no one else, therefore, unless they too were taken over by an even richer nation state like Japan or the Netherlands, would be able to compete. Both systems have anti-competitive elements built into them, but one of them, at least, again, theoretically, leaves clubs on a stable footing should they lose their owner funding at some stage. So the Big Six, despite faltering at times on the pitch, are still as big and powerful as ever off it. It is also worth noting that, even on the pitch, their regression can sometimes be somewhat exaggerated. There is a degree to which our expectations taint our perspective. The perception of Aston Villa and of Newcastle is that they have been brilliant over the last few years, while Spurs, Man United, and even Chelsea have been terrible, and, relatively speaking, that is of course correct. Nonetheless, if you strip away the context in which they exist and our expectations of them, the reality is that Villa have only qualified for the Champions League, or finished in the top 5 once, winning nothing during that time, and Newcastle have only just qualified for Europe for the second time in over 10 years, having gone out in the group stage in their only other Champions League campaign, and a League Cup win this season constituted the club's first major trophy in 70 years. Manchester United, by contrast, as bad as they are in relative terms, have still reached 5 cup finals in the last 5 seasons, winning both the FA Cup and the EFL Cup, and they have featured in the Champions League thrice during that time. Even Spurs were in the Champions League knockout stages only 2 seasons ago, they just won the Europa League, and they will be back in the Champions League next season. In fact, out of the so-called Big Six, only Manchester United won't be in the Champions League next season, and they still won't drop out of the top 10 richest clubs in the world, owing to the fact that they are still the biggest and best supported team in the biggest and richest league on the planet. Things can sometimes feel a bit more catastrophic for the Big Six than they actually are, and a bit more promising or hopeful than they actually are for so-called disruptor clubs. The switch from the top 2, top 4 or top 6 to the Big Six was a clever and accurate sleight of hand. The Big Six are no longer the top 6 most seasons, but even when they finish 15th or 17th, they are still the 6 biggest clubs in terms of revenue, fan base, and their ability to rebound from setbacks and mistakes and compete again in the imminent future. The top 6 era is probably dead. That much has been acknowledged in the subtle change of terminology, but the Big Six are alive and well, posting record revenue, and in little to no short-term danger of losing their Big Six status. It is much more likely, For that reason, that the Big Six could become a Big Seven or even a Big Eight if Newcastle, Aston Villa or anyone else managed to consistently qualify for the Champions League, something which is easier now, owing to the Premier League likely having 5 Champions League spots indefinitely, move or renovate and expand their stadiums, and grow their global fan bases over time, then it is that any of the Big Six will fail spectacularly enough to lose all of the advantages that they have built up over the last 2 decades and beyond. Despite Big Jim's best efforts, and he is giving it a bloody good go to be fair to the lad. Maybe he is just an incredibly passionate advocate for the Football League pyramid, and he is trying to dismantle the hierarchies of the English game. Arise, Sir Jim, sacking tea ladies and managers at a truly frightening pace, all in the name of fairness and redistribution. Or maybe not. Anyway, that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it or found it remotely interesting, and as ever, I really do mean remotely. You don't have to have liked it very much to hit the like button. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my other channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on social media, usually via the username @HITC Sevens, and elsewhere on the internet, and you can now become a channel member, both on the Alfie Potts Armour YouTube channel or via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potts Armour, should you wish to support me additionally. All of the links to do all of those things should be down in the video description below, but more important than any of that, I hope that you all have a magnificent day, week, month, and who knows, even year, fingers crossed. Thank you all for watching. I will see you shortly. Cheers.